They were 12, men of no status, fishermen, tax collectors, zealots. Yet they were chosen by a wandering preacher on the sun-scorched roads of ancient Judea, a preacher whose words defied the laws of men and the rules of time itself. But this was not a path of comfort, not of glory, not of wealth. It was a path of sacrifice, a journey marked by faith and sealed in blood. The world remembers them as saints, as martyrs. But what if I told you their fates were far more terrifying than you ever imagined? What if the stories you've heard were only fragments of a greater, darker truth? Some were crucified, some were beheaded, some were flayed alive. Others vanished into the shadows of history, their final moments shrouded in mystery. But why? Why were these men, once simple and unknown, hunted, persecuted, erased? Were they merely victims of an empire's wrath? Or was there something more? A secret they carried, a knowledge too powerful for the world to accept. For centuries their deaths have been wrapped in legend, recorded by the faithful, distorted by time. But what really happened? What lies beneath the pages of scripture and tradition? And who wanted them silenced? Tonight we tear through the veil of history. Tonight we uncover the tragic end of the 12 apostles of Jesus. But be warned, what you think you know may be far from the truth. Stay with me until the end, because this mystery goes deeper than you ever imagined. John the Apostle, the survivor of the storm. John, the one they called Beloved, the disciple who leaned upon Christ's chest at the Last Supper, a privileged witness to the most sacred and terrifying moments in history. He saw the light of transfiguration, he saw the shadow of betrayal, and in the end he was the only apostle who stood at the foot of the cross. He did not run, he did not hide. He watched as the sky darkened, as the ground shook beneath him, as the breath of his master faded into the wind. And yet, he was the only one who did not die a violent death. A death defied. The others fell by the sword, by the cross, by fire and stone. But John was different. Tradition tells us that John was taken captive under the reign of Emperor Domitian, dragged before the Roman elite, accused of spreading a message too powerful to silence. And so they tried to make an example of him. A cauldron of boiling oil, a death so gruesome, so absolute, that no man could survive. But John did. He did not scream, he did not burn, the flames did not consume him. Witnesses claim it was a miracle, that the oil did not touch his skin, that, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before him, he stood in the fire untouched. And in their fear, the Romans did something unexpected. They banished him to a place meant to erase a man from history, the island of visions, Patmos, a barren, windswept rock in the Aegean Sea, a prison without walls, but inescapable nonetheless. For years John wandered its shores, alone, forgotten, or so they thought, because it was there, in the darkness, that he saw the future. A sky split open, a beast rising from the sea, a dragon waging war against the heavens. The book of Revelation was born. A message so profound, so terrifying, that it would shape the course of history. But was his exile a blessing or a curse? Did John find peace in those visions, or was he tormented by what he saw? Imagine knowing the fate of the world, seeing the rise and fall of empires, hearing the echoes of the final battle long before it begins. Would you call that a gift or a nightmare? The mystery of his death. John lived longer than any of the apostles, outlasting emperors, watching the first churches rise and the first martyrs fall. But his final days remain a mystery. Some say he returned to Ephesus, that he lived to an old age, passing away peacefully. But others whisper of something more. His tomb, when opened, was found empty. No remains, no relics, just the silence of the unknown. Did John die, or did he simply disappear? Some believe he was taken, like Enoch, like Elijah, that he was too close to divine truth to remain among men, that the heavens opened, and John was called home. Or perhaps he still walks among us, a silent witness, watching, waiting, until the final prophecy unfolds, the question that remains. John knew something so powerful, so unshakable, that not even death could claim him. The Romans could not kill him. Time could not erase him. So we ask, what did John see? What did he know? And more importantly, has it already begun? Subscribe to Path to the Unknown, because some mysteries are too great to be left in the past. James the Greater, the first apostle to fall, the first to follow, the first to fall. James, son of Zebedee, walked alongside Jesus from the very beginning. He saw the miracles. He heard the secrets of the kingdom whispered in the dead of night. He stood on the mountaintop as Jesus was transfigured before his eyes. But what he did not know, at least not at first, was the price he would pay for his faith. His death would not be peaceful. It would not be quiet. It would send a message, the mark of a martyr. The year was 44 A.D. The Roman Empire stood unshaken, its power stretching across vast lands, its rulers believing themselves gods among men. And in the province of Judea, one man ruled with an iron fist, Herod Agrippa I, a man desperate to solidify his power, to win the favor of the Jewish authorities. And he knew exactly how to do it, by crushing this growing movement of Jesus followers. The Christians were spreading like wildfire, unstoppable, fearless, preaching of a resurrected Messiah who claimed authority greater than Rome itself. Herod needed an example, a warning, a sacrifice, and he chose James. The apostle was arrested, shackled, and thrown into the depths of a Roman prison, a dark, cold cell where the air reeked of sweat, damp stone, and something even more suffocating. Fear, not for James, but for the men around him, because James was not afraid. He knew. Did he see it coming? It was Jesus himself who had told James and his brother John, "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" James had answered without hesitation, "We can." But did he truly understand what he was saying? The cup was not a reward. It was not a blessing. It was a sentence. The same suffering, the same fate, the same bloody end that Jesus himself would endure. And now that moment had come. The doors of the prison flung open. The guards dragged James into the streets. The crowd had gathered. Herod's order had been spoken. Execution, by the sword. It was a swift death, but not an easy one. James knelt. The steel was raised. And in that moment, a soldier stepped forward. A death that sparked a fire. This man, this Roman soldier. He had watched James from the moment of his arrest. He had seen something unbreakable in him, a peace that defied the fear of death, a faith so strong it could not be crushed by chains. And something inside the soldier broke. "I will die with him." His voice rang out through the execution grounds. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The soldier had seen the truth, and in that truth he found a faith so powerful that he chose martyrdom over life in the empire's service. Moments later, he knelt beside James. The sword fell, and two heads rolled into the dust. Rome's warning and God's plan. Herod Agrippa believed he had struck fear into the hearts of Jesus' followers. He had underestimated them. The death of James did not silence the movement. It fueled it. Because James's sacrifice was not in vain. His blood became the ink that wrote the next chapter of Christianity. His martyrdom proved that this was no ordinary faith. This was something greater than Rome. And as for Herod, Within months of James's execution, the same king who had ordered his death stood before a crowd, basking in their praise, allowing them to call him a god. And in that moment, something unseen tore through him. A sudden, violent pain, a sickness, a rot from within, and history records that Herod Agrippa, the murderer of James, was struck down, eaten by worms. Coincidence or divine justice? James drank the cup he had been given, and in doing so he left behind a legacy that Rome could never erase, because long after the empire crumbled, his story remained. Peter, the rock that fell. The man called Peter was more than a disciple. He was a fisherman turned into a leader, a man who once walked on water only to sink when his faith wavered. Yet, in the end, his faith was unbreakable. Under the scorching gaze of Emperor Nero, Peter became a target, not for who he was, but for what he represented. A threat, a symbol of defiance against the empire. Rome was burning, and Nero needed someone to blame. Christians became the scapegoats, rounded up, tortured, slaughtered in the name of imperial justice, and among them stood Peter, captured, shackled, dragged through the streets of Rome, a man who once fled in fear when Jesus was arrested, now walking towards his own execution with unwavering resolve. But Peter did not beg, he did not plead, he did not run. He knew what awaited him, and he had only one request. I am not worthy to die as my Lord did, not by sword, not by fire, not by poison. He was to be crucified, but not as Jesus was. Peter chose to be nailed upside down, a decision of humility, a final act of devotion. Can you imagine the agony? Blood rushing to his head, his body burning in pain. The world inverted as he took his final breaths, the jeers of the crowd, the laughter of the soldiers. Yet through it all, he was silent, not in fear, but in resolve, because Peter knew death was not the end. He had denied Jesus once, but this time he would not fail. His death was a statement, a declaration that no ruler, no empire, could silence the voice of faith. The ground beneath his execution would become sacred, a place of pilgrimage, a foundation for something greater than Rome itself. Today the Vatican stands where Peter fell. His bones rest beneath the grand basilica that bears his name. But here's the question. Was his sacrifice in vain, or was it the beginning of something eternal? Andrew, the cross of humility, a testament of unshakable faith. A man hanging from a cross, not in defeat, but in triumph. His name was Andrew, the brother of Peter, the fisherman turned disciple, the man who walked beside Jesus from the very beginning. But while Peter's fate was written in the heart of Rome, Andrew's final stand would take place in the distant lands of Greece, on a cross unlike any other. This was not the standard Roman crucifixion. It was something even more horrifying, a cross shaped like an X, a symbol that would one day bear his name. But in that moment it was not a symbol. It was a death sentence, a fate sealed in faith. The world saw Andrew as a threat, a man whose words could not be silenced. He had journeyed across foreign lands, preaching the gospel, healing the sick, defying the gods of the empire with a message of love, redemption, and a kingdom not of this earth. But this was Greece, a land of powerful rulers, a land where the old gods reigned. The Roman governor, Aegeates, saw Andrew as a dangerous enemy, a man who refused to bow to the gods of stone and fire. And so the verdict was set. Death, but not just any death. A death that would be slow, a death that would be painful, a death that would break any man. Or so they thought. The cross that became a throne. As the executioners drove nails into his hands and feet, they expected to hear screams, cries for mercy, desperate pleas. Instead, Andrew praised the cross. Yes, the very instrument of his death. He did not fear it. He embraced it. As the wooden beams rose into the sky, the Roman guards stared in disbelief. The man they were meant to break was rejoicing. "This cross," he declared, his voice echoing through the execution grounds, "is the gate to my Lord." The crowd watched, mesmerized. Andrew had turned a punishment into a holy sacrifice, a symbol of shame into a symbol of glory. 3 days of defiance. For 3 days he hung there, not in silence, but preaching. With every breath he spoke the words of Jesus. With every moment he transformed his suffering into a final testament of faith. The people gathered, they listened, and some began to believe. Even the executioners, hardened men who had witnessed countless deaths, begged him to stop, to save his strength. But Andrew would not. He could not. This was his purpose, his final gift to the world, a lasting legacy. The governor, shaken by what he saw, ordered his release. But it was too late. Andrew looked toward the heavens, a smile still on his lips. And as the final breath left his body, the sky seemed to weep for the man who had embraced his fate with joy. His body was taken down. His followers mourned. But his spirit, his story, would never die. For centuries, the X-shaped cross has stood as a symbol of Andrew's humility, his devotion, his unbreakable faith. And today it whispers a question to all who hear his name. What does it take to look death in the eye and smile? Thomas, the doubter's redemption. For centuries, his name has carried a shadow. Doubting Thomas, the skeptic, the man who refused to believe. He had walked beside Christ, seen the miracles, heard the words that shook the heavens. Yet, when faced with the impossible, the resurrection, he faltered. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, unless I place my fingers in his wounds, I will not believe. A moment of weakness, or something deeper. Some call it doubt. But perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps it was a mind that demanded truth, not just faith. The warrior who walked beyond the edge of the world. While the other apostles spread the gospel through familiar lands, Thomas went farther, much farther. He journeyed east, beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, to a land of emperors and mystics, a place where gods had been worshipped for thousands of years. India. There he did not find crowds eager to listen. He found resistance. Yet he persisted. In the heat of the southern lands, among temples older than time, he preached of a single God, a carpenter from a distant land who had risen from the dead. And against all odds, people listened, they gathered, they believed, and the seeds of Christianity were planted in a land untouched by Roman rule. Even today, churches in India trace their origins back to Thomas, a testament to a man who refused to stay in the shadows of doubt. But what he built would come at a terrible cost. The martyrdom of the skeptic. Powerful men saw Thomas as a threat. His words spread too fast, his followers grew too many, and so a decision was made. A group of assassins, a mission to silence him. A death that would be swift, but not painless. Spears were their weapon of choice, and under the scorching sun in a foreign land, Thomas was struck down. Blade after blade pierced his flesh, his blood mixed with the dust of a land that was never his home. A final lesson, paid in blood. But did he doubt in his last moments? Did he question everything one last time? Or did he finally see? Did the man who once demanded proof now gaze beyond the veil of this world, seeing with absolute clarity the truth he had spent his life defending? The paradox of faith and doubt. Thomas was not weak. He was not a failure of faith. He was a symbol, a reminder that doubt is not the enemy of belief, that those who question are often the ones who go the farthest, the ones who seek, who challenge, who demand to see for themselves, and in the end, they are often the ones who leave the deepest mark on the world. His name should not be remembered as an insult. It should be remembered as a testament, a man who doubted, a man who believed, a man who gave everything, not just for a cause, not just for a story, but for the truth. And the truth always has a price. Judas Iscariot, the betrayer's curse. There was one man among the 12 whose name would forever be drenched in infamy. Judas Iscariot, the traitor, the one who sold his master for 30 silver coins. But why? Was it greed? Was it FEAR? Or was Judas merely a pawn, trapped in a game far greater than he could ever comprehend? Historians and theologians have debated for centuries. Some say he was a man obsessed with wealth, his heart consumed by the jingling of silver in his hands. Others claim he was driven by disillusionment, expecting a conquering Messiah, but finding instead a teacher of humility and sacrifice. And then there are those who whisper a far more disturbing theory. What if Judas believed he was doing the will of God? What if he thought that by forcing Jesus into the hands of his enemies, he could spark the divine intervention he so desperately craved? A fatal miscalculation, a decision that sealed his fate. The night of betrayal. The air in Jerusalem was heavy that night. The Last Supper had ended. The Master had spoken of betrayal, and the disciples were uneasy. But Judas knew he had already made his choice. Under the cloak of darkness, he met with the priests. 30 silver coins slipped into his palm, a price set for the blood of the Son of Man. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, he led the soldiers. A kiss, a gesture of friendship turned into a symbol of treachery. And then, the chaos, the torches, the swords, the shouts. Jesus was taken. The plan was set in motion. But something went wrong. Judas had expected a trial. He had expected Jesus to prove his divinity, to call down legions of angels and claim his earthly throne. Instead, Jesus remained silent. He accepted his fate. And suddenly Judas realized the gears of destiny were moving, and he was the one who had set them into motion. The price of regret. The 30 silver coins, once a prize, now felt like a weight, a curse pressing into his flesh. Judas ran. He stormed into the temple, throwing the blood money onto the floor. "I have sinned," he cried. "I have betrayed innocent blood." But the priests, they laughed. It was done. The silver no longer belonged to Judas. It belonged to his choice. He had sealed his fate, and there was no way back. Death of the betrayer. Judas was alone. No master, no allies, no escape from the horror of what he had done. And so he walked into the night, his mind a torment of voices. Some say he found a tree, tied a rope, and ended it himself. Others claim he fell, a descent so violent that his body burst open, his insides spilling out onto cursed ground. 2 versions, 1 truth. His death was as violent as his sin. And the silver, it was used to buy a field, a burial ground for strangers, a place that would forever be known as the Field of Blood. His name, Judas, became a warning, a name that no one would dare to take again, a name that became synonymous with treachery. But there is one final question that haunts us even now. Was Judas beyond redemption? Many believe that Judas was damned the moment he made his choice, that his soul was lost, his fate sealed. But what if that wasn't the case? What if Judas's betrayal was not just an act of treason, but a necessary step in the greatest sacrifice in history? What if he was not just a villain, but a tool of divine will? After all, without Judas, there would be no crucifixion. And without the crucifixion, no resurrection. Could it be that Judas's role, his terrible, agonizing role, was part of a story far greater than his own? A story of death, a a story of redemption, a story of sacrifice? We may never know, but one thing is certain. The name Judas Iscariot will never be forgotten, and his curse will forever haunt history. The cost of faith, a legacy written in blood. They were not gods. They were not invincible. They were men. Men who walked the same earth as we do. Men who knew fear, who felt doubt, who endured pain. But when the moment came, when their lives hung in the balance, they chose faith. They chose sacrifice over safety, truth over silence. And because of that choice, they paid the ultimate price, a death that was not the end. Many look at the deaths of the apostles and see tragedy, a movement crushed under the weight of persecution, a faith extinguished before it could take root. But they are wrong. Their deaths were not the end. They were the beginning. Each drop of blood spilled did not silence their message, it amplified it. Each martyrdom did not destroy their cause, it cemented it into history. Their suffering was not in vain. It was the foundation upon which generations would stand, a testament to the unbreakable power of belief, a legacy that refused to die. When James was beheaded, his followers did not flee. They grew. When Peter was crucified upside down, his voice did not fade. It multiplied. When Thomas was speared in a distant land, his mission did not end. It expanded. The apostles understood something we often forget. Death is not the worst thing that can happen to a man. A life without purpose is far worse. They chose to die for their beliefs, to embrace the unknown rather than betray their faith, to walk into the darkness knowing that a greater light awaited them. But the question is not about them. It is about us, the challenge for us today. We live in a world that demands compromise, that rewards comfort over conviction, that asks us to stay silent when the truth becomes inconvenient. But look at the apostles. Look at what they were willing to endure. They did not back down. They did not choose the easy road. They stood in defiance of fear, of power, of death itself. And so we ask, if they were willing to die for what they believed, what are we willing to live for? The world is watching. The choice is ours. The story is not over. It is only the beginning. The story of the 12 apostles is not just history. It is a testament to courage, to conviction, to the power of faith. But it is also a warning. Faith is not easy. Truth is not always safe. These men, ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, and zealots, were not born as warriors. They had no wealth, no armies, no power, and yet they defied empires. They challenged the might of rulers. They carried a message so powerful that it shook the very foundations of the world. And what did it cost them? Everything. They were hunted, beaten, tortured, killed. Not one of them lived a life of comfort, and yet not one of them abandoned their faith. Because they saw something greater. A truth worth dying for, a purpose that went beyond their own lives. Some were beheaded, others were crucified, some were stoned, speared, or flayed alive. And yet their voices did not fade into silence. Their words became flame, a fire that no persecution could extinguish, a torch that has burned for over 2,000 years. Their deaths were not the end. They were the beginning. A beginning that stretched across centuries, shaping the very course of civilization. And yet, the world still resists the truth. It silences, it mocks, it persecutes. Even today, to stand for something greater than yourself is to invite ridicule. To hold on to faith in a world of doubt is to stand alone. And that brings us to the question that few dare to ask. Would you have followed? Would you have walked away from everything you knew? Would you have faced the might of empires, knowing it would cost you your life? Or would you have turned away? Would you have denied? It's easy to admire the apostles from a distance, easy to call them heroes. But it's harder to walk their path, to live with their courage, to embrace their sacrifice, because the cost of belief is often paid in blood. And yet, for those who walk the path, the reward is beyond anything this world can offer. And so the question remains, would you have followed, or would you have faded into the silence of history? The choice is yours. Subscribe to Path to the Unknown, because the search for the truth never ends.